A lot of people in the community say that you shouldn't spec on villains. Well, in this video, I wanted to look at some of the numbers with you guys and see if that's really the case. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video with Swaggle. And in this video, we got to talk about villain spec. That's right, villain spec, one of my favorite things to talk about. And specifically in this video, I'm going to talk about this idea that kind of exists within the community that, villain spec is something that you shouldn't do, or it's bad to spec on villains because their values completely tank after the fact. And so I kind of want to pull up some examples with you guys, talk about some of the characters that have had recent success in Marvel, and see if we can kind of, come to some conclusion with this idea of villain spec. But before I get into the video, if you guys could drop me a like or a comment or subscribe if you're enjoying the content, help support the channel, do one of those things, and I would appreciate it. All right, with that being said, let us get into the video here today. And I realize that the soapbox that I'm about to go on with you guys might just be, me going off on a technicality with the word spec. Maybe we should be asking the question, should you invest in villains? Because right out the gate, if you were asking ourselves, should you spec on villains? I'm going to tell you 100% you should spec on villains, because if you're specking the right way, meaning purchasing a book and anticipating that, later on down the line, we might get, a villain in the MCU in some kind of way, well, no doubt about it, you're going to make money on that speculation. You're going to definitely be able to turn that book around later on when a trailer comes out or a movie comes out and be able to get your money and get a pretty decent return on your investment. In fact, for a lot of spec with regards to villains, you can even get a better return on your investment than even with some kind of heroes, because, specs for villains usually come out of left field. They come out of nowhere. Whereas the heroes are already characters that people want to collect and already have some kind of value. With the speculating of, like, say, the Wrecking Crew, you could get that book for a $5 or so in an LCS, and then now when you get the rumor that they're going to be in the MCU, this can be a book that you're selling for $80-90 or so. So already with your villain, you're going 10x on your investment versus a hero character that presumably that book is already going to have some value, and maybe you can 2, 3, 4x on it, but the buy-in to invest that money into it was probably going to be a lot higher than what it took for you to sort of spec on a random villain. But before I continue to go down this path, I do want to qualify something a little bit. When I talk about villains, I'm talking about villains that have, historical significance within comic books. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about Marvel villains that have a relation to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, if we're talking about villains like that are more modern, if we're talking about modern comic books like Null or Black Winter or Codex, things like that, I think that stuff is really, really volatile. So I'm not going to be, specifying those. I'm talking about villains that have, a following, that have history within comic books. But putting the word spec aside for a second, if I'm going to be very charitable to the people in the community who say you shouldn't spec on villains, what I think that they mean is that you shouldn't invest in villains. Meaning, if you're going to pay a premium on a book and you're going to expect, to have that book, grow into something later on down the line, people would often say that, superheroes are a better way to do that. And for the sake of, this video, I am going to tell you that right out the gate, yes, that is truly the case, that, for the most part, 9 times out of 10, a superhero comic book is going to slowly give you a return on that investment, more so than a villain book. But what I want to point out in this video is that it's actually not the villain that is the issue as far as an investment is concerned. In fact, it's not necessarily even the superhero that is the thing that gives you the return on your investment. What we're talking about as far as an investment is concerned is how relevant is a thing to pop culture, meaning how much demand is going to be manufactured for this book over the course of the long term. And so one of the problems with villains in general is that, we get a event film like a Thanos, who we're going to talk about later on in this video. We get an event film with him, there's a lot of hype around him, and then he's sort of out of sight, out of mind after he goes away after Endgame. So that's one of the problems versus a character like, say, Spider-Man, where Spider-Man is always going to be in the MCU. He's always going to have an ongoing comic book, and he's always going to, have a cartoon, and he's going to be on pajamas. So the manufacturing of his, excitement and relevance to pop culture is always going. So therefore the, the book's value is always going to hold. So when we talk about, don't spec on villains, what we really could be saying is don't invest in things that are not going to keep up their pop culture demand. This could apply to many different types of, mediums. This could apply to, one-off movies, like when Godzilla gets really hot for, a time. Yeah, that book goes up because everyone's excited for Godzilla. But once we're past that movie, nobody cares about Godzilla. Or maybe we're talking about a storyline comic book like the Infinity Gauntlet. So when we're getting, Infinity War and Endgame, everybody's going for that Jim Starlin Infinity Gauntlet #1. And then once we're past that and it has no more relevance to pop culture, that book definitely takes a dive. So ultimately, to me, it's this idea of the perception of how relevant a character is to pop culture that is the thing that keeps the value, not so much the fact that it's just a villain, for instance. So I want to show you guys some numbers and kind of, go off that sort of hypothesis, and we'll take a look at the things together. So let me pull up the GPA analysis, and I want to go just through a few books with you guys. So the first one I want to talk about, of course, is Iron Man #55. This is the first appearance of Thanos. It's also the first appearance of Drax and the first appearance of Star Fox and Kronos and Mentor, characters that, nobody really cares about, but generally speaking, we're going to talk about it for the sake of Thanos right here. So let's go into the GPA analysis here, and there's a couple things I want to show you guys. So I wanted to pull up just kind of, the 9.2 grade because I feel like this has the largest sample size compared to some of the other grades that we can kind of use to track the plotting here. And so if we're looking at this book, we first got the first tease of Thanos right around here in Avengers #1, right? The summer of 2012 it essentially was where we got Avengers #1. So you could see the anticipation was bringing this book all the way up, all the way up, all the way up. And then we eventually got Thanos here in about 2018. This would have been, right before the release of Infinity War. A lot of people anticipating this, really excited about this. And, of course, we got the movie and it was great. And then we got Endgame right up here, probably around here. For about April of 2019. And then after Endgame, once Thanos was dead, here you see this big lull, right? Everything is dipped down here. And everyone started selling and everyone was like, Thanos is done. We don't want Thanos anymore. Yada, yada, yada. And then we get the 2021 comic book boom, and we're back up to the top. So actually, right now, if you were to have a 9.2 of Thanos and you bought it at the height of the market back in 2018 with Infinity War, you're actually still doing okay. You are actually at the same value you were when you bought the book. But so far to the, people saying that villain spec is not a good thing, this is definitely like a pretty damning evidence right here that, once you get the villain and they're done, their book is totally going to tank. Because if you're, someone who bought it at the height of the market with like Endgame, you spent all of 2020 having lost money on your investment. But let's take a look at another book here for a superhero character. And this is one that is also perceivably done, quote unquote, within context of the MCU. And the book I'm talking about here is Strange Tales 180. This is the first appearance of Gamora, right? So we got Gamora in the MCU. People were excited about her. And then her character died in Infinity War. And yes, she came back as a different version in Endgame. But let's take a look at some of the values of her book and see what it did. So here you see similar path. We have, Gamora coming out in 2014 here with the Guardians of the Galaxy. So maybe, there were some trailers that were released here for Guardians of the Galaxy, and then it got a little bit of a bump. This is the 9.4 grade. Again, I'm just picking out plots that are generally, have a higher sample size. So this is a 9.4 for this book. And then we see here, kind of trade sideways for a time, trade sideways. And then eventually we get Guardians of the Galaxy 2, which is around 2017. So somewhere here. So maybe there's a little bit of a spike. And then we got Infinity War and Endgame, and everybody was really hype about it. And then we see right here, this is 2018. This is after she dies from this film. We see that there is actually a big rounded dip right here, right? So everyone's like, oh, Gamora's dead. We got to sell this book. She comes back in Endgame right here. So maybe there's a little bit of a bump that people are thinking, oh, okay, she's actually going to be back in Endgame. And then we find out, whatever, she disappears off into wherever. And then we see this downward trend right here. So again, everybody is done with this book here in 2020. And then, because we, got the 2021 boom, we're back up here. We're back up into this, bullish cycle. So we go back to the Thanos one and we compare it to, Gamora. And actually we're seeing very similar paths for this book, right? This villain character right here and this hero character right here, very similar paths overall, where the market decided or anticipated that, oh, this character was done or dead or whatever. We got this big lull right here. And then the 2021 boom kind of brought us back up. So really interesting to sort of compare those things. But let's take a look at, this other book here that I want to show you guys, which is Avengers 196. This is the first full appearance of Taskmaster. And I kind of want to compare it to Tales of Suspense 52, the first appearance of Black Widow. So two characters, again, who, again, Avengers 196, we got Taskmaster in the Black Widow movie. And, we're going to take a look at some of the numbers here. And then Tales of Suspense 52, for a lot of people are thinking that Black Widow is quote unquote done in the MCU. So what does that mean for her value? Now, she's a superhero character, so presumably her book should be able to hold value compared to, something like Avengers 196, which is a villain character, because, once villains are done, they're done and nobody cares about them. So let's look at some of the numbers here again for Avengers 196, the Taskmaster book. And I'm going to focus in on the 9.6 because there's just, again, a larger sample size. So we got the original Black Widow trailer in the end of 2019. So it would have been right around here. So this little, these kind of, what you could say is these candles that are kind of going up for this book, probably around 2018 it was probably announced that Taskmaster was going to play a role in the Black Widow film. So we got a little bit of a bump here. And then of course, the hype dies down after the announcement. And then we get the trailer in the end of 2019. So right around here. And we see that slowly but surely this book has been climbing up. It got pushed out all the way up until 2021. And then here, right before the movie comes out, this book is super hot, right? Everyone is jumping on this book. And now, because it's a villain, because the movie is done, nobody cares, right? So now we're in this downward trend right here. So again, to this argument of, villains not holding their value, that sort of makes sense. We're on a downward trend with Taskmaster. But this is interesting because let's talk about Black Widow's trajectory right now and what her book is doing, because she is a superhero, but the perception is that she also is done in the MCU. I mean, we know that she's dead, and then especially with Scarlett Johansson having all the drama she's having with Disney right now, we can assume that Black Widow is no longer going to play a role. So let's take a look at her books right here. Here I have a 5.0 grade, just again the most data right here to take a look at. So again, we see this book. Let's go to the 2020. We see with the rise of the film and the anticipation, this book is going up right here, and then at the height, it hits this peak, and then down here again. Well, what are we seeing? We're starting to see this downward slope right here, downward slope. We can take a look at this in other grades too, that this is not just the case for the 5.0. We look at the 4.5, we can see the graph here is going downward. We're seeing this downward slope now that we're past the movie. We can look at another range here. This is the 4.0, and again, what do we see? We see a downward trend. So again, this is also a book that is going downward. So even though it is a superhero, this is also falling victim to the fact that, we, the market, perceive this character as being done in the MCU or being done as far as their pop culture relevance is concerned. So this is really interesting to me that, when we're talking about, villain spec, villain investing, superhero spec, superhero investing, ultimately, it's not so much that the villains are the problem. What is ultimately, to me, as being evident in the numbers, is that the popularity and the relevance to the pop culture is the thing that is the problem. Because, if we take a look, character like Loki, their book, Journey to Mystery 85, that book is still holding really strong, even though that character, is a villain. We all know that character is going to continue to play a role in the MCU, and therefore that book is able to kind of hold its numbers because of the constant demand for people wanting to get their hands on that book because of the excitement of the properties that they're going to be involved in. So ultimately, to me, I think this is really interesting and something that I kind of wanted to challenge as far as like villain spec is concerned, is that it's not so much that, villains don't hold value. It's that villains typically are not always involved in storylines, whether it's in comic books or cartoons or movies, and therefore their books can be a little more volatile. But so long as that villain has some kind of relevance to, pop culture, they're always going to be in demand. So this is something that is not exclusive to villains. This also applies to superheroes. This also applies to independent comic books or TV show options or movies or, Godzilla-like characters or cartoons or whatever the case may be. A book, as far as an investment is concerned, is only as valuable as it is relevant to pop culture. And typically, superheroes tend to be more relevant because there is constant properties being built around them, whereas villains don't necessarily have that same kind of thing. Although we are now moving into a new, era of the MCU, and I think characters like Baron Zemo, Loki, Enchantress, if you want to call Sylvie Enchantress, I think that these characters, these new kind of MCU characters, are going to have major roles all throughout, the length of the MCU. I don't think that these characters are ever really going to die or go away. And for that reason, I think that villain books are going to start to hold the value that superhero books hold because they're always going to be relevant. Anyways, that's all for this video. That was just me kind of looking at the numbers with you guys. Let me know what you guys think. Do you guys think villain investing is something that is worth doing? I think that villain spec, of course, will always give you a good return, so long as you're not buying this thing at the trailer and you plan to flip it, a few weeks later. I mean, if you're buying this off of the rumor, I think that that spec can give you a great return on your money. Anyways, drop me a like, comment, subscribe if you're enjoying the content, and we'll see you in the next video.